If you would all be so kind, and we'll start with you, Eli, and we'll just kind of work around in clockwise order. If you could tell me your name, who you work for, and anything else that you wish to share with the kind people listening to this podcast.
Hi, yes, I'm Eli. My pronouns are they and them, and I'm a developer advocate at Scaleway, which is a small European cloud provider. We've got data centers all over Europe, all your dev tooling, all that good stuff. And before that, I was developer advocate at a small developer tooling company, and then before that, I've done a bunch of stuff: data engineering. Started out writing C straight out of university, so spent some time in the trenches of sort of real programming. I like knitting and Tolkien and hanging out with my cat and generally being paid to be a professional nerd. So that's me.
Hi everyone, my name is Abdel. That's my nickname actually. If you look me up on LinkedIn, you will find probably my long Arabic name, which a lot of people have difficulties with, so I just go by Abdel. It's easier for everyone. I am a cloud developer advocate at Google. I've been at Google for almost 10 years now, so I'm a cloud developer advocate focused on Kubernetes and service mesh and pretty much anything containers. I co-host the Kubernetes podcast. Maybe some people here are listeners. If you have been listening since October, I am one of the annoying voices because we are two hosts on it, actually. The other host is my colleague, Kathleen Fields, who lives in Seattle. So yeah, I do pretty much everything around containers and Kubernetes. My upbringing is kind of weird because I did software engineering as a master's degree, but I never really worked as a software engineer. I worked in data centers, which is kind of a place where not that many people actually work, I guess. My first job actually was in a data center back home in Morocco, and then I moved to Google to join data center in Belgium. And then, as I like to say, I've been moving up the stack in terms of abstraction layers. So all the way from hardcore servers to virtual machines to containers to whatever AI is going to bring in the next 10 years. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome, thank you. And Neil?
I'm Neil, CEO and co-founder of Portainer. I like to describe myself as an engineer because to think otherwise would horrify me. I have been 25 years building, breaking, and fixing things. VMware engineer, IBM guy. I dabbled a little bit with development. I am embarrassed to say it's Visual Basic though, so I don't know if that's actually development or not. But started out with Basic, so that also shows my age. And I like to make things easy. I hate complexity. I think complexity is the root of all evil, and I like to make things easier for people. That's just my natural born hobby. Actual hobbies is fishing and hiking, for those that know me. So I love being outdoors.
All right. Thank you very much. So this is the first episode of the Cloud Native Compass, and we're going to keep today's topics broad, as you're all aware. We're going to kind of take a look at a cross-section of the cloud native landscape, and that being cloud and containers and Kubernetes. So I prepared 3 or 4 questions in each of those categories, but of course, Adrian, Anurag, and anyone else who wants to join, if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat. And if you really want to, feel free to raise your hand and we will promote you and invite you on to ask your question live. So we're going to start with the first question, which I know everyone's going to love because it's a topic that a lot of people find frustrating but important, and that is the cost of cloud adoption. So based on my own experience of going to events over the last kind of 12 months, maybe broader, I see that the cost of their cloud instances or the software services that they're using on these cloud providers seems to be growing and becoming more and more of a challenge, especially in the macroeconomic climate right now, where costs are a big problem. So I'm curious if this is something that you're seeing with your own experience, your own customers, your own partners, and if you have any advice or best practices to help people navigate this tricky situation.
I can have a comment. We have a lot of infrastructure in the cloud. It's actually our entire QA environment. We obviously have to spin up Docker standalone environments, Docker Swarm environments, Nomad environments, Kubernetes clusters of multiple different versions. So we support 3 versions back. And so every single time we release a new version of Portainer, we've got to spin up environments and test everything against it. So we've got environments that come and go frequently throughout the day. So we might spin up a cluster, it's live for an hour while some QA testing is, and then it's pulled down again. And we do this across almost every cloud provider you can possibly imagine. We currently support 6 cloud providers that we test and QA against. So we've got instances everywhere. That gives me a pretty good insight into how much money each provider costs for relatively the same thing, because it's always the same environment that's stood up across the providers. And it's eye-watering how much money we spend. And one of the things that I've kind of figured out is if you have a relatively consistent workload, like the CPU and RAM allocation is consistent, and you can right-size your environments, it's probably pretty good in the cloud. If you've got environments that are very, very bursty, and you would be able to benefit from oversubscribing physical VMware hosts or Proxmox hosts if you want to do things a bit cheaper, if you can benefit from oversubscribing and making sure that you can time slice, it's probably substantially cheaper. We're actually going to be moving a lot of our workloads back from the cloud into a cloud bare metal as a service provider running virtualization, and we think it's going to save us quite a bit of money in that landscape. So, it definitely, the cost differential between the top 3 and everyone else, I think, is still large. There's a large gap. You pay a premium for the top 3 versus everyone else. Yet I think the capability gap is narrowed. Previously, if you wanted a really reliable service, you went to one of the top 3, and if you wanted something a bit more niche and more cost effective, you went to anyone else. I think that's definitely narrowed out a lot now. You get some very, very reliable services from DigitalOcean, Linode, Civo, you name them. You get some very, very reliable services super cost effectively now. So that's my views on it.
Anyone else like to add anything there?
Well, my flippant answer was going to be, if you're on Amazon, then you can always hire the duck bill group. Get Corey Quinn in to come and chop down your bill, right? It does make sense to me, though, that making sure that you are buying exactly what you need is an answer, might even be the best answer. Like that feels right.
I think Ellie beat me to it, but I was about to say there are people who built businesses on top of this idea of cost optimization, and Corey Quinn is probably the best example of that, right? They help people optimize costs. And I think there are a few factors that determine like how much you're going to spend in the cloud. And I am in my line of work seeing more and more people kind of caring about the cost. There is, if you have been to KubeCon in Valencia last year, there is like an entire trend around FinOps that have been starting around, and there are a bunch of booths of companies doing basically financial optimization for companies. So there are a few factors. One factor is, and this is something I've seen in my experience, is that people just turn things on and forget them, right? So just they go around to a cloud console, they turn a feature on, and they never look at it. There is also what I call hidden costs. Sometimes you would turn a feature on, I don't know, a bunch of virtual machines, but there is an underlying login that you are charged for, but you don't see it. You have to go dig into the documentation to understand how those logs are built. I have had this before with Google Cloud, specifically customers coming to us and they go, well, our login bill is much higher than everything else we are spending money on, right? And that's because they're just writing logs, and logs cost money. And you can basically, anything that is a hidden feature that gets turned on automatically without you knowing, that could be a problem. As Neil said, like the margins between raw compute across the 3 premium cloud providers is getting very narrow, and the other non-premium cloud providers, if you want to call them so, are getting also very close, like DigitalOcean, OVH. They're starting to beat AWS and Google Cloud on pricing, right? And so what I'm noticing on my end is what a lot of cloud providers are doing. They are moving toward kind of more added value services. All right, instead of just selling you raw compute, we're gonna give you like containers as a service. So you don't have to worry about all the underlying complexity of the infrastructure. There is one comment I want to add, and I'll just stop here. I think when we talk about costs, a lot of times people like to compare apples to apples, where you say how much CPU memory costs me on-prem versus how much it costs me in a cloud provider. And they tend to forget the cost of engineering, right? When you are paying Google Cloud to run your virtual machines, you're not only paying for that virtual machine, you're paying for all the engineering work that goes behind it that makes the service reliable. And of that engineering work, you will have to do it yourself if you would host the VM yourself, right? So if you start thinking about your engineers as an investment center rather than a cost center, then it's an entirely different discussion around cost optimization, right?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. One, you mentioned that there are products popping up now, and I think that's very true. We're seeing Terraform integrations that try and tell you on a pull request what your plan or the changes to your infrastructure as code is actually going to cost you on a rolling monthly basis, which is interesting. There's things like kube cost, which try to predict what a Helm chart can cost you when you deploy it to your cluster, which again is quite interesting. And I think something else that was interesting there that you mentioned is like the understanding that you've got the operational cost versus the capital expenditure and operational expenditure. So as a company, you have to make the decision: do you want to own hardware and be an operator of hardware and provide a service, or do you want to pay a little bit of a premium and just use one of these cloud providers? And I think these are a lot of challenges that people need to make.
Oh, I was just going to say that owning your own hardware does come with its own operating costs as well, because who's wearing that who's wearing the pager? That's one of the things you get with the cloud provider, right? It's not you.
Definitely in a production environment. I know when I started writing dev or being a dev, like we had a cupboard that had a rack in it that had 4 servers on it, and that was dev and staging and QA and pre-prod. And to be honest, like it didn't really require much maintenance. If anything went wrong, you pulled the plug on it and turned it back on, and it was bare metal. 40 minutes later, maybe you had a working machine again. Who knows? But we're now in a situation that we're probably engineered for ourselves, and that cloud native predominantly means microservices, right? And running microservices in a production-like environment, even if it isn't production, usually requires more than one machine. With our monolith, you could spin up a bare metal server in a cupboard, or even just some, not a Raspberry Pi, but you can stick some novelty hardware into a cupboard and deploy a binary to it. But with microservices, that's not really an option anymore. It's like we've engineered ourselves into this cost paradigm, which I'm sure there are pros and cons to. But what's people's thoughts there? Like, have we made this mess ourselves?
Well, it's also, just be careful you don't do binary alternates, right? So yeah, like as I said, we're moving to bare metal as a service and a cloud provider. So we get an entire server in a managed data center from a provider with high levels of SLA and internet connectivity and everything else. So we just get a console access to it. We can install VMware on it or Proxmox, whatever on it, and start building our environment. So yes, we have to manage the hypervisor layer as a cost saving, but we're not worried about the data center or the server or any of the connectivity requirements of it. It's highly available. So there's actually a nice halfway house as well in between fully managed by a cloud, hardware managed by a cloud or self-hosted. And I don't think I would ever even consider reverting back to fully self-hosted now. It's just too hard now, and there's no need. But definitely being able to have your own dedicated hardware, being able to overcommit that hardware at a ratio that you're comfortable with, that makes sense for your business, then that's definitely a viable option to save money, lots of money.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a public migration right now happening with Hey, the email company, and Basecamp, where they've given up on the cloud and said it's too expensive, and they were citing costs. I think was it like $3+ million per year to run their email service, and they've went all in and buying their own hardware and sticking it into a data center and managing that themselves. And you're right, I could never imagine going back to that level of operational complexity. I like the simplicity of cloud. I like the fact that we can burst up and burst down based on what's happening. I mean, the companies have predictable load to be able to do that. Like, it just doesn't seem like that's the case anymore.
Well, I have to say something about this whole Basecamp and Hey situation. I mean, all respect to the person who wrote those articles. There is one thing I am not able to understand is at that scale, at $3 million per year, they have a very powerful negotiation power, right? They're not paying premium prices. They're not paying catalog prices, or they shouldn't be paying catalog prices at least, right? If you're a customer of a cloud provider whose bill is $50,000, if you bring AWS or Google Cloud, they will tell you, like, just go away, we don't care, right? But if you're paying $3 million per year, then you can sit down at the table. And I've seen customers negotiating up to 50-60% discounts on raw compute by spending a couple millions a year, right? So I read those articles. I could not understand why the cost was substantial and why they were complaining about it. And also, if I was in their shoes, I would not consider going back to the run my own server situation. And Neil said something interesting, like bare metal as a server is a thing, and it's kind of halfway between, fully managed and so somehow half managed, I would say. So I don't like the articles that you're referring to. They were doing kind of an apple to apple comparison, and that's what I always advocate against, right? Like just look at the catalog prices of AWS and Google Cloud and Azure and say like, oh, see, this is expensive. I can rent a VM for half that price. That's not the full story.
Yeah, I do wonder if at Scaleway we will see more people coming back to, we have elastic metal servers, because historically that's been just steady. There's steady, consistent demand for those. So it'll be interesting to see if more people adopt, your approach, Neil, of mixing and matching and finding the right tools for the actual sort of more well-suited tools for each job.
All right. Well, based on where this conversation is going, and based on what the next two questions are, I'm probably going to ask them both and just throw them out there and let you tackle whichever one you want to. But the next question is, again, from going to conferences and speaking to people at the conference, I'm seeing a lot more people adopt cloud providers outside of the big three. Like, we have Azure, we have AWS, and we have Google. But, I think what a lot of people are agreeing with is that costs are cheaper when they go to the smaller cloud providers. They're also more targeted and seems to be able to innovate in a certain space faster than the major players. So that could be a driving factor there. And I want to kind of touch on that. But you also both, or all three of you mentioned, kind of hybrid architectures. And if I think back to early COVID, and even before COVID, there was a lot of buzz and talks at KubeCon and other events where people were talking about hybrid cloud and multi-cloud. And I'm not seeing that anymore either. So I'm curious if you
say that.
Yeah, so maybe you can share some thoughts on, are the smaller clouds at an advantage, and are we going to see more adoption there? And is there a hybrid play, a multi-cloud play that is disappearing, or maybe I'm just not seeing it anymore?
Well, I'll do a tiny product pitch here, which is that Scaleway does run a multi-cloud Kubernetes managed service. So we have your control plane and everything lives on Scaleway, hardware and architecture, and then you can put your nodes wherever you like. So we are definitely... We're hoping that the multi-cloud isn't dying as a concept. I think it's something that, maybe it will never be mainstream, but there will be use cases for it. And I think it should be easier for people to do.
Yeah, hybrid cloud, I think, is, or multi-cloud, however you want to describe it there, I think is actually pretty important because it does let you have the right cost for the right application. Like, why would you want to run dev environments on the top three and pay a premium if you don't need the high levels of service availability and everything else that comes with the top three that you just get and take for granted? If you don't need that for dev, test, QA staging, whatever, call it what you like, then why would you run them there? Why not run them somewhere that's substantially cheaper? That's one of the great things about Kubernetes, right? It's this unifying layer. As long as you can deploy into Kubernetes, you can deploy anywhere, and you're going to get relatively the same result. Now, I say relatively because the cloud providers like to make you somewhat sticky, and so they're trying to encourage you to use their authentication and their logging and all their other stuff. And if you buy into that and go all in on Amazon's authentication, IAM, everything else, then it makes it very difficult to then go and use any other cloud provider. So as long as you have some way of normalizing or neutralizing how you authenticate users in the clusters, how you handle RBAC, how you handle all of the policies and everything else, how you do all that, and don't use it from just one provider, then you can balance your loads and have the right provider for the right workload. And I think that's key. Otherwise, it makes it very difficult.
That does require a pretty decent working knowledge of which provider would be the best for each workload. If you're conceiving a project from scratch and you go, okay, I have this very high GPU usage workload that needs to happen. There's if you don't already know off the top of your head where do you want to run that, that's that's research time, I suppose. But then you're saving money as a result. So,
well, just have two: high cost, high SLA, low cost, lower SLA, and just balance that way. Prod, non-prod. Even start something simple as that, right?
I'm gonna have to go a little bit against the flow of what's have been said. I understand all these points; they're all very valid points. But I think one of the problems I have with hybrid cloud and multi-cloud discussion is it tends actually to always focus on a single layer in a stack. Like what Eli and Nain mentioned, they just talked, the Kubernetes, you can do Kubernetes across the cloud because it's unified API. But in reality, no application lives in a vacuum. You need a database, you need storage, you need messaging queues, you need a bunch of extra things. You're not going to stick your app on AWS and put your database on Google Cloud. That doesn't make any sense, right? You're not going to put your your application on a container on DigitalOcean and have your Kafka running on AWS. That doesn't make any sense. So where I see this is again, this is my own opinion. Where I see multi-cloud valuable are few of the following cases. Some of the following cases, this is from experience. First is location or availability of the service. There are certain industries where you are required by law to be in a certain physical location. And if your cloud provider doesn't have presence in that physical location, then you will have to choose another one. That's one valid use case for multi-cloud, right? Or maybe either physical location because regulations or because you want to be close to the user from a latency perspective, right? So that's would be one. The second one is you touch on this a little bit is added value services. Like if you want analytics tooling, probably Google Cloud is one of the best places where you can have like a data warehouse with BigQuery. So you go to the cloud provider because they have a service that they are the only one offering and they are doing it very well, right? If you want cheap compute, you probably go to AWS because they have been doing that for a while and they optimized even their costs to be able to offer VMs for cheaper than the other two. If you want developer tooling, you go to Azure. They have a pretty good DevOps stack, which a lot of developers like, especially if you're in the .NET space, right? So that's another use case of multi-cloud, in my opinion. This, I would call it world where people want to run a single abstraction layer on top of 6 cloud providers and have a single API to talk to them, and then have the app automatically move from one cloud provider to another because, it's not that data center is down. That's just very hard in practice to actually implement, I would say. So I'm not dismissing that multi-cloud is valid. I just think that people think about it from a single layer perspective in the entire stack, and that's probably not the right way to do it, but that's just my opinion.
I think you're all in more agreement than you probably realize, because I think, Abdel, what you came at it from there is like the production use case where, I don't want to manage my own stateful databases in production. So I am going to use like Cloud Spanner or Cloud SQL, etc. But then I think Eli and Neil were more of the, let's slice our environments across clouds, like have dev and staging live somewhere else and not really speak. Like they're never going to use, I'm not going to pay for Cloud Spanner for my dev server or my staging server because it's just not cost effective. But I probably would stick it on Scaleway or Civo or Linode or any of these other providers and maybe rely on Google Cloud for my production workloads because I do want to hook in to more of those value added services. And I think that's actually probably a pretty good way for people to start leveraging cost savings by moving those lower priority environments or more ephemeral environments down other providers. Plus, it gets them more familiar with the tooling as well. Maybe their infrastructure as code is going to improve because they've now written it in a modular fashion where it can be augmented with a different cloud provider at runtime. Who knows? Like everybody's going to do something a little bit different. But I do think these were all in more or less agreement in some way there. We agree?
Yeah, well, there are also open source alternates for almost all of the cloud provider services. So for non-prod, you can actually stand up an entire kube manifest with your database layers, your messaging layers, whatever else, and actually make it stateful. So you can do that. Would you do that for production? Yeah, probably not. You'd probably want that with a really high SLA, specialist who knows how to run databases amazingly well. So, but yeah.
Yeah, we're seeing some really interesting stuff like CockroachDB with their serverless authoring. It's really interesting. We've got Neon.tech, which is doing like this managed serverless Postgres as well. There's PlanetScale, who do Vitesse MySQL in a cloud environment. So like if people are already storing their state in these other services and just using cloud providers for compute, maybe they have more flexibility to really understand and mitigate any cost explosion there too.
So here is one interesting fact for you guys. I don't know if you've seen you're all aware of the last the registry migration, the artifact registry migration for Kubernetes that happened over the last few months, right? I've been so we did like an episode on the podcast about that, and we interviewed one of the software engineers who led that effort. And in researching that topic, I came across a document that was written by some people in the CNCF. In which they analyzed, like they just highlighted what's the problem statement and how they're proposing to solve it. And in that problem statement phase, they said there was something around, they analyzed the traffic that was going toward the Google Container Registry, so k8s.gcr.io, the old one, And they realized that about 70% of the traffic going there was coming from AWS IP addresses. So actually a lot of people on AWS that are so these are not EKS. It's not the AWS managed Kubernetes pulling from our container registry or from the KSS1. It's people standing their own Kubernetes cluster on top of AWS using tools like kubeadm or kubespray, because kubeadm and kubespray uses the old registry to pull images from, right? And that was a very interesting fact to learn. It's like, okay, there are a bunch of people doing their own Kubernetes cluster on top of AWS, which is
why would you? Exactly. It's so weird.
You already have the expertise. You want to be lower in the abstraction sort of offerings. I don't know. There must be significant use cases for it if they're seeing that much traffic.
I run my own.
Yeah. And so actually the migration toward the new registry was driven by this, because the project, the Kubernetes project, used Google Cloud to host the artifacts and host the CI/CD pipelines, etc., etc. But they realized that out of the $5 million that Google Cloud was giving them every year to pay for everything, they were paying 50% of it on egress costs. That's all the image pools going toward a different cloud provider, right? So the new registry, if you look at the details of the implementation, it's just a very simple proxy that forwards you toward either AWS or to Google Cloud based on where you're coming from. So they're actually hosting images in both cloud providers so that they can cut on the egress costs.
That's so clever. That's really funny. Yeah, I had no idea.
Yeah, it was a very interesting realization, 70% egress cost going toward AWS, which was okay, sure, there are a bunch of people doing that.
Well, I think this gives us a nice segue into our next topic, because registries are expensive and people that operate them may want to register costs. And a very notable company made some decisions lately that kind of angered the cloud native community. And of course, I'm talking about Docker, who kind of made themselves the villain when they announced that they were deprecating, removing, deleting, whatever they were doing, the free plan, which meant that a lot of people who host their container images on the Docker Hub were told that within, was it 30 days or 90 days? I don't remember exactly. Their images were going to be deleted. Now, they've rescinded it. They've said, okay, we're going to migrate people to open source programs, and we're going to give, I think there is some sort of free plan now, but do we forgive them, or have they broken their trust one too many times now?
I think there's definitely going to be fear, because if you can just change a service with only 30 days notice, what else can you change? Is the price for other services going to be 10 times this next week because they choose that they need to change it? So there's definitely going to be fear as a result. History often repeats. So if that is becoming a behavioral trend to do these kind of things, then I think there'll be fear for what will happen again in the future. Most providers have EULAs that say we actually reserve the right to change this at any time without any warning, and that's part of their standard agreement. So I think there's going to be fear. I don't know whether there's much more impact. Like if you can think back when they changed the licensing for Docker Desktop, and there was a huge uproar on that. But they're making millions from Docker Desktop licensing. So did it have that much of a negative effect on their business? The inverse, it had a massive positive effect on their business by making that change. So it's hard there. At the end of the day, if you're an open source entity, you have to be commercially viable to continue. They have to find ways to monetize, and could it have been commed better? Absolutely.
I think this is where I struggle, right? I think Docker changed the game for everybody in this community, right? We all have a lot of respect for Docker and the team and what they've done. We want Docker to succeed. But like you said, it's not the first time they've violated our trust. And they've done it so catastrophically through very poor communication, not really bringing people along with them with the changes, saying, hey, this is why we're doing this thing, and this is what we need to do to keep our business alive. They've just come out with the big delete hammer, the big sledgehammer, and went, sorry, it's going away now. And the Docker Desktop one was another one. We've seen so many alternatives pop up now, from Rancher Desktop to Podman Desktop to Colima and all this other tooling, trying to give people alternatives. Even recently, OrbStack released a product as well to kind of compete with this. So I don't know where I am on the trust radar here. I still want Docker to succeed, but I'm not pushing any more images to Docker Hub.
Well, we just pay the money and a Docker verified publisher because we get immense value from their technology, and it just feels like it's a moral obligation to help them as a company succeed and grow and keep creating the technology that's changing the game. Everybody relies on the Moby project that's almost entirely funded, by Docker and that dev effort. It just felt like the right thing to do. It's interesting. I don't know if you saw Mirantis when they started monetizing Lens. They went through the same kind of thing that Docker did with desktop, and they also semi-surprised the industry and said, "Hey, by the way, you know how it's open source? Yeah, it's not really. The version we publish is actually our closed source version, so the license changed." And there's also equally, strong backlash, and that's why now this Open Lens came out of nowhere. So it's kind of, you got to be super careful monetizing open source and do it, very, very gracefully, gently, and transparently.
I mean, is open core still a feasible business model for open source?
That's what we are.
I think there's ways and ways of doing open core, right? I mean, if you open source part of your business logic sort of thing, do you accept pull requests from people outside of your organization, or is it publishing, sort of broadcasting rather than accepting incoming contributions?
So for us, we actually accept PRs into our Portainer CE version. We've got two code bases, Community Edition and Business Edition. They're linked behind the scenes, but we accept PRs against the C edition, and then we will ourselves backport it to Business Edition if we so want. So yeah, we absolutely do.
Right. So, and then if you so want, so there would be PRs in the Community Edition that are not present potentially in the Business Edition. Do you then see those two things diverging? And at what point does what's open no longer match what's in the core, as it were?
So I use so if we so want, they're probably a little bit too openly. Everything is currently in CE as in Business Edition. In the future,
the reason I ask is because my previous company ran on the exact same model, but we didn't really find ourselves accepting PRs. I would accept
PRs all day, every day. It makes the product better, and why would I not? If someone raises a PR against our open source product that competes against the business product, I'd still consider it and accept it. All I'd say is then obviously there's not enough value add for that particular feature in the Business Edition, and we need to be more creative and come up with a new value add. I think that's what makes a very healthy open source variant, is that you don't make it a walled garden and closed and you control it. It has to be open. If it's not open, then it isn't open source.
I would agree, yeah.
I think that this whole Docker mishandling communication in the last one, and it have happened a couple of times, and it happened to other companies. Redis was one of them when they changed the licensing a few years back. It happened to a bunch of other companies. It always reminds me of these quotes of like, this is why we cannot have nice things. It's just that basically as a community, we are entitled to free stuff. We just think that whatever we use is free and should remain free forever, right? And when a business goes like, oh, no, folks, this is not going to be free because we have to make money on this. We are paying people and offices and, engineers and everything like that. Then everybody goes crazy and forget the fact that, well, you're probably using stuff for free and you're probably not even contributing to them, right? So it's a very hard thing to balance, like balancing open source with commercial is very difficult. I think that the last Docker announcement was probably more a case of mishandling communication than anything else, right? One of the things I was thinking about as that whole situation was kind of unfolding is, as a community, if we think that there are a bunch of stuff, containers, for example, that are important. Like one of the person who was very vocal about the Docker change was Alexei, the OpenFast founder. He wrote like a bunch of articles about it, etc. And for me, I was thinking like, why don't we as a community use the same model of the CNCF in terms of open governance and decide, okay, all these open source projects that are important enough for everybody will be hosted by an independent entity and paid for by everybody, right? So why don't we have a CNCF equivalent or CNCF themselves that manage and runs a version of Docker Hub that is free to use for everybody who wants to use it, but somehow everybody have to contribute to it, either financially or through your code contributions, right? And this is probably a far-fetched idea. It will take time to unfold, and I'm not sure even it will happen. But we tend to forget that relying on a single provider is never a good idea anyway, right? I can give you an example actually of a project I worked on, which was even funnier than this. I'm gonna okay. So there is a database called Aerospace, something like that. It's like an in-memory database, very popular. That one of my customers was using, and they were using a version of it which has a commercial license, but the free edition allows you to run up to like 32 nodes cluster, right? And you combine them in a single, cluster. And the company behind came up with the new version, and they said, okay, in the new version, the open source edition, you can only run 4 nodes clusters. And if you want to run more than 4 nodes, then you have to pay for it. That company, that customer I was working with, they were already running at max. They were already running 32 nodes. And what's even worse is that company said, okay, we're releasing version 4, and 3 months from now, we're deleting the binaries for version 3 from our repositories. So my customer ended up dumping the binaries for version 3 and putting them in a Dropbox. So they guarantee they cannot, they have the binaries going forward, right? So I don't know, it's very difficult. I also don't know how to feel about this whole thing. I just feel you are breaching the trust of your community when you do a sudden change and you don't communicate it properly. And you don't communicate the intent behind it, which is very important, right?
Yeah, I think when you're having these difficult discussions, you always have to start with why the decision has been made.
Yeah.
And I don't think Docker did that. Like if they turn around and says, we will not be in business in 12, 24, 36 months because here's the costs of running Docker's hubs free tier, and it's not feasible. People would go, oh, all right, okay, that's that much. And maybe they'd have a bit more empathy for the company. But the communication didn't come across that way. And also, we're a very entitled bunch, right? Developers. Oh, you gave me this thing for free? Oh, cool. I'll use it. I'll use it. I'll use it. I'll use it. Oh, you're taking it away. I hate you so much. I mean, and I'm seeing lots of people move to GHCR. Like GitHub's container registry seems to just become the new default because it's where all our code lives. But how long are they going to run that for free?
Exactly. Do we have a guarantee that Microsoft 10 years from now, they're going to go like, okay, GitHub container registry is not free anymore, right?
And we're back to, have a server in your basement and serve all your own containers images yourself, I guess.
Pretty much.
All right, let's say something positive about Docker. I was really excited by their WASM announcements recently. I love that they're opening up hybrid architectures with WebAssembly and containers side by side, and the fact that I can do this with kind of Docker image pool and OCI artifacts. But not only that, they announced support for Docker Compose, where I can run WebAssembly binaries as services, speaking to a Postgres database running in a container, and everything works together cohesively. And I think this is really exciting for WebAssembly and for Docker. So I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts, if they played with it, did they like it, did they not like it? Feel free to share.
So for edge use cases, I think it's quite amazing. There's still a real problem at the true edge, and I'm talking around the industrial edge, where you've got micro devices, which are, they are computers. They have an ARM 32 CPU. They've got a gig of RAM, and really your only choice today for running containers at that type of edge device is Docker. Everyone talks a great story about Kubernetes at the edge. Not at that edge. Nowhere near. And so if your only option is to run full fat containers on that device, still a slow ARM 32 CPU and 1 gig of RAM only goes so far. And so the more efficiency that you can get out of it, the faster I think we're going to see the adoption of things like Industry 4, because industry invests in technology and they expect that technology to last 10 plus years. They're not going to go refresh their entire hardware estate overnight because they want to do containers. They want to find a way to repurpose what's there, and it's old and slow. So I think WASM at that edge is going to be amazing because it lets you get so much more efficiency, or it's so much more efficient way of delivering applications at that edge. In the data center, I'm not convinced, but
that's an interesting take. I think I see actually there is quite a lot of movement across the major cloud providers to start supporting WASM for serverless stuff. So WASM as functions, or WASM as for container service type platforms, which you can do today, I guess. Like with the Docker support for WASM, you could basically write a WASM module and run it inside Docker container, And if your cloud provider allows you to run Docker containers on top of the platform, it will just work, right? I think for functions, I see a value, especially that basically WASM programs or binaries are very fast to start. And for specifically functions as a service that have always been a problem, the startup time or the cold start time or whatever you want to call it, right? So if WASM can solve that by giving you a fast to start binary, that's probably a good place for it to be, right? But yes, I think I have to agree with you in the sense that I don't see it as something where 5 years from now, everybody will say, okay, right, we're just going to rewrite all our apps in WASM. That's probably not going to happen. So the other one probably is the sandboxing aspect of WASM is a very compelling feature to a lot of companies that allow you to run third-party code on their platform, like cloud providers with functions and stuff like that, right? Like as a cloud provider, you should inherently not trust people shipping code and running it on top of your infrastructure. And the more you can sandbox that code away from other customers running on the same host, the better it is. And WASM has a very good sandboxing environment, right? So yeah, that's my take on it. I think we'll have to wait. This is gonna unfold over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I want to quantify some of the things you mentioned there. So Cloudflare announced their Workers project, which is their functions as a serverless kind of workload thing, supports WebAssembly workloads. They announced that like 2 weeks ago, which is cool. And they have 256 edge locations. I know Neil's going to be like, that's not edge, but they have these locations out there for people to run these workloads. And as far as quantifying it, WebAssembly runtimes, binaries can be started in microseconds compared to like a container, which we're talking 500 milliseconds probably to start a container, set the sandbox up, especially in a Kubernetes environment. It's a little bit slower. I think that's quite interesting. But there's also the data aspect. It's like with container runtimes, you have to pull the image, and container images are not small, right? Yes, we have container images in the megs, but we've all seen them tens of megs, hundreds of megs, and even gigs of container images. So even the pull time on that can be slow. Whereas WebAssembly binaries, again, are very, very small, typically 4 to 8 meg, depending on the complexity of the application. Of course, your mileage may vary. I'm not saying all of them are. But I think at those numbers, that is a really compelling story for developers who want to do things that way. And then the sandboxing is just a kind of cherry on the top, right? It's like you get all of those benefits without having to deal with Linux C groups, without having to worry about the architecture of the application. Yeah, Go cross-compiles, but am I cross-compiling for ARMs? Am I cross-compiling for x86? Like, these are all concerns that I hope we don't need to worry about. And I do actually agree. I don't think we're all going to be writing WebAssembly in 5 years, but I do think we'll be writing a mix of WebAssembly complemented with container-based workloads.
Another space where I am seeing WebAssembly also growing very fast is, I don't know how much you're familiar with Envoy, the proxy. Mm-hmm. Envoy supports WebAssembly as a filter. So Envoy is a very extendable proxy, and you can like add filters to it, and those filters can be written in Lua or in WebAssembly, right? And with that, you can actually implement a lot of complex logic at the filter level. So you can do authentication and authorization and a bunch of extra things. Rate limiting, for example, stuff like that. And Envoy, although it started with Lyft, it is being adopted. We are changing all our load balancers to be Envoy-based at Google. I know at least one company, Spotify, I know that they are running Envoy as their edge proxy. They're not doing WebAssembly today, but they're thinking about it. So, and I think probably Neil would not agree with this. I still think this is an edge case where you're running a proxy at the edge of your network and pushing a bunch of that logic that you're doing in the backend to the proxy layer. SSL termination is something we've been doing for a while, but like authentication, authorization, blah, blah, closer to the user is of value, right? And I think the reason why Envoy and WASM are becoming interesting is because all the other proxies that existed for a while have not been innovating that much. Like Nginx did not change much in the last 10, 15 years. HA proxy did not change much in the last 10, 15 years, right? They probably support HTTP too, but like who cares, right? So yeah, I see that as another kind of area that would be interesting to look at or to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think WebAssembly as an extensibility model is definitely on the rise too. Like you said, with Envoy, Red Panda has like a built-in WebAssembly runtime for doing stream transformations on events going into the system. And there's a really cool framework that I don't remember the name, and I'm not going to remember it, but it's like a desktop extension model. So if you write desktop apps, you can now write WebAssembly modules that get hooked into it, and it makes it run on Mac, Linux, and Windows without having to worry about anything else. I think that's quite an interesting use case too. All right. We are very quickly running out of time. So unless anybody would like to share more on WebAssembly, I'm going to suggest that we move on to our final topic for today, which is Kubernetes. Any last words on WebAssembly?
Kubernetes it is.
All right, awesome. Well, I'll throw this one over to you, Abdel, since you've already mentioned it. But very recently, the register change as part of Kubernetes is a big deal. People need to know. Well, I guess it's not as important anymore because of the automatic redirect, but there's still things people need to know. So maybe you could share a little bit on what's happening and what's important for people to take away.
Yeah, so a little bit of context. Kubernetes was up to 1.26, which was released December last year. They were pushing all their images to k8s.gcr.io. So GCR stands for Google Container Registry, which is a Google managed version of Docker Hub, essentially, or Docker Registry. And k8s.gcr.io was a subdomain that Google created specifically for Kubernetes, right? It was kind of like its own instance. It did not share infrastructure with the rest of the container registry space. So they created like a subdomain and they just give it to the community and, and then, I talked about this earlier. They realized they were running out of money because, spending way too much money on egress. So they decided to do the migration. And the migration today, or the migration essentially was, we're going to move from k8s.registry.io toward registry.kubernetes or .k8s.io, which is essentially, if you care about the implementation detail, it's a proxy running on top of Cloud Run, which does the redirection. It's a very low weight Go binary. The code is open source. You can read it. And essentially what it does, it receives the request. It looks at the IP address and it uses a Go package, which can give you the list of known IP addresses that AWS use. So if your traffic is coming, if the request is coming from AWS, it forwards toward the container registry of AWS, right? So the images are still technically mirrored across both Google Cloud and AWS. And maybe they are planning to add more cloud providers later. What happened basically is AWS came to the Kubernetes community and they said, we're going to give you money to be able to host stuff on AWS, right? And maybe later more cloud providers will chime in and they will be able to do the same. But essentially now when Kubernetes is built, they will push all the artifacts toward all the cloud providers. They're mirroring them on Google Cloud and AWS and maybe Azure in the future. And then this proxy, this little Go binary, just forwards, depends on where the IP is coming from, right? And that's gonna help a lot with pull time. So if you're on AWS and you're pulling for the new container registry, you will see a significant improvement in terms of the pull speed, right? And yeah, just reduce the cost on a single cloud provider and kind of distribute it across multiple cloud providers. So that's the context.
Do you know what that is? That's multi-cloud.
That's multi-cloud. Yeah, that's actually a very valid point. I was waiting for somebody to make a comment. And actually, you know what it is, to be honest with you? It's basically what we used to do with Linux packages, just mirroring Linux packages across multiple servers, right? It used to be a long time. When I was living in Morocco, I did establish a mirror for APT in Morocco. I bought a bunch of servers and we established, we set up a mirror for APT packages. And that's essentially what this is, except it's done by the community, not by a bunch of volunteers, right?
How is it not just a CDN?
It is a CDN. It is very much a CDN.
So I'm surprised that Google just didn't host all images on a CDN.
Well, I think that the reason is because containers require a very specific implementation of the registry itself, right? The registry API is very specific. It's not like a picture or like a CSS file that can just put on an HTTP server. That's due to the client implementation of the kubelet on Kubernetes, because the kubelet is not just doing an HTTP pull request. It's using the Docker registry client's library to pull the image, right? But I would agree with you. If images could be pulled through a standard HTTP request, then why are we bothering with this? We could just implement it on top of like a CDN, right?
All right. Well, thank you for sharing all that. So we've got a couple of questions left. So Adrian, anyone else in the chat, if you want to ask any questions before we finish, drop them into the comments, and we'll move on to developer portals. So a trend that I've seen through reviewing CFPs for a couple of conferences, and again, speaking to people at conferences, is that Backstage has really kicked off this new, I don't want to use the word movement, but this initiative where teams feel like they need to have developer portals that give them a gateway into their infrastructure, their services, their projects. And I'm curious, is this something that you are seeing again with your own customers and partners? Do you use yourself? And what is the value proposition that people are looking for here? Is it purely developer experience, or is it something else that I'm missing?
Well, I'm still unclear on the difference between a developer portal and like a console view for what you're doing with your cloud provider. Is this for things that you've got on site, or what, sort of agnostic to where the things are actually running? Or
yeah, so the Backstage, as an example, is kind of used to give you like a service catalog. So as a developer team deploying microservices, it'll actually show you all the services, how they interact with each other, the message formats, visual overviews. We're seeing extensions now where it can hook into Kubernetes and give you some limited capabilities there. It can hook in to your cloud provider and show you IAM models and RBAC rules and a whole bunch of other stuff. So
gotcha.
We're seeing this kind of DX-based portal experience trying to make developer teams more efficient. I'm not sure if that's the value add, but yeah, Neil, you were going to say something there too.
Yeah, I was going to say, as Kubernetes or containers get more and more and more mainstream, you're getting into the realm of web devs, front-end developers. In all honesty, those people who know how to use, those developers who know how to deploy and manage applications on Kubernetes are probably full stack, and now they're extra full stack in order to be able to do that as well. But there is a huge proportion of the developer community who probably see themselves as front-end devs or web devs, and they may or may not have the skills to be able to do infrastructure tasks. And so there is definitely a need for an abstraction where you say, I just want to take my code and I want to deploy my code, off you go. And that's where I think these kind of dev platforms will shine, is being able to engage with the dev in a language the dev speaks, which is code, and being able to get them and or have a bunch of pre-canned templates available. They can just click to deploy and they get their server up. They can then go and push their code into. I think it's critical as we get more mainstream, we get into more emerging markets where the level where there might be more of a skills delta. I think it's just a sign of maturity of Kubernetes.
All right, can we try an experiment? Are the three of you happy to try an experiment? You smiled. I'll take it. All right. There was a report recently that said GitHub just crossed 100 million monthly active users. So let's pretend that this is science and there's 100 million developers out there in the world. So in the chat box, and don't hit return until I ask us all to hit return, type how many developers you think have used a kube control command. And the audience can feel free to do this too. So don't hit return.
Chat box.
Yeah, but just type a number. And I'm going to count to 3, and on 3, we can all hit return.
I can't even find the chat box.
At the bottom, there should be, there's a timer saying we've been live for 58 minutes, and then there's a little square for chat. So in the chat box, type a number of how many developers out of the 100 million have used a kube control command, and we'll all hit return at the same time. Has everyone got a number?
I do.
All right, so on 3. 1, 2, 3. Wow, we all went very different. So I said 500,000, Eli's 5,000, Neil went in at 10 mil, and Abdel saying every developer has run a kube control command. I mean, we'll never know, but I just, KubeCon has 10,000, a sellout event at 10,000 people going to Amsterdam. As a general rule of thumb, when I talk about developers that go to user groups and conferences, I always say if you go to these things, then you're in like a 5 to 10% bubble of people that really want to push their knowledge and their careers and other things. But I've always made that number up, so I really have no idea.
Right, so I'm extremely low because I think, well, I don't know. The practitioners of a thing always think the thing is more widespread than it actually is. How many people on GitHub are just using it to host like little personal website that they'd made, or
but now you're claiming that 50% of the attendees at KubeCon have never run a kube control command.
Yeah, but if we're doing prices right, I still might be right.
Yeah, I mean, probably. I don't know. We could sample it when I'm there. Maybe I'll just run around with a pen and paper and say, "Have you run a kube control command?" and see how many people I can get to answer it.
I guess that probably you are right in the sense that there are probably people using Kubernetes without running the kubectl command, right? Like the dashboard, if you deploy the Kubernetes dashboard, you don't need the command line. You can just deploy things from the dashboard. So there are probably people who are using Kubernetes, but they're not using the command line. They're just using some sort of high-level abstraction layer.
But is Kubernetes still not? I mean, it's growing. We can see that through the CNCF. We can see that through projects, open source contributions, especially people at conferences. But it's still niche, right? Like arbitrary number, 90% of people that write code are probably deploying to something that's not Kubernetes. Still, is that right? Is that wrong?
Kubernetes, maybe. Containers, I would say, is more mainstream. I just this last weekend, I was walking down a random street in Berlin, and there was, those big digital signboards. And so we're walking down the street, and there's 20 digital signboards in a row, each selling. And as I walk past one, I'm like, oh my God, that's Docker Desktop. And basically the signboard had crashed, and in the screen was Docker Desktop, with the stack for the software. It's crashed, and I'm like, okay, cool. You just never know where you're actually gonna come across containers. So I think containers have far more adoption than Kubernetes, but Kubernetes adoption is definitely rising.
Yeah, I'd be curious to pay attention. GitHub and Stack Overflow do annual reports where they ask a whole bunch of questions. And I haven't checked, so I don't know, but maybe containers and Kubernetes adoption is in there, and there are numbers. So I'll see if I can find them and share them with people afterwards. But fun experiment to see. This is complete for wildly different guesses. But I'll take it.
I'd be very interested to see the results if you do a straw poll of running around KubeCon and asking people, have you actually run kube control?
I mean, of course I'm going to do it. I'm going to film it at the same time. So yeah, it's
Fantastic.
going to happen.
To be honest, asking it in an echo chamber, you might get a very different result than across a more broad spectrum sample. So if you go to an actual dev forum.
Yeah, I was about to say that. I think it would be more interesting to go to a conference which is not cloud native focused. So one of the conferences I want to go to next year is called Scale, South California Linux Expo. It takes place in Sacramento, I think, every year. And my co-host was there and interviewed some people for the podcast. And from the interviews I listened to, there was like a wildly different spectrum of what people are interested in, right? It's like a totally different population. They are not in containers. Like some of them, they say, we heard about this thing called Kubernetes and we're thinking about looking at it, but they're still in, hardcore Linux, low-level kernel stuff. And there is actually an article that I've read a long time ago. I have to dig it up and find it. I think it was called Shadow Developers, and I don't even remember who wrote it. It was this person who said like we people who are on the internet, we're only exposed to a certain population of developers. There are a bunch of people, like your developers sitting in like a town hall of a city of, I don't know, Canterbury in the UK, writing Visual Basic code on top of Microsoft Access databases. That's a developer as well, right? Are they going to fill in a Stack Overflow survey? Probably not. Are they going to go to a conference? Probably not.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we come up against in DevRel, right? It's like you can only reach the people who you know about, and then there's all this sort of like dark matter. Where are all the people who aren't on the internet, who aren't terminally online?
All right, I've gone a little bit over. I just want to check. Does anyone have a hard stop, or are you okay to answer one more question and we'll finish up for today?
I'm good to go. I'm good to keep going, rather.
Well, I think
I can keep going as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think given everything that we see on Twitter these days with OpenAI, and ChatGPT, that we should talk about the way that may influence our little niche Kubernetes and Docker and container bubble and the way that we work. And specifically calling out Alex Jones from Canonical's project of KHJPT, which hooks into like the Kubernetes event log and audit log to tell you when things are wrong with your cluster and tell you how to remediate them. Is this something we're going to see more of, and is it going to take all our jobs? Which is hyperbole,
it's awesome.
Of course, but I'm going to
seriously awesome. It's very, very cool. Yeah, triaging is one of the things that, and let's be honest, 90% of us see an error, copy paste it into Stack Overflow, and look for the answer anyway. So this is just automating that loop.
I like that we've now got to the stage where we've written software so complex that we need to write more software to understand it. We are, I don't think that our jobs are at risk because you ask ChatGPT anything about real facts and it spews you complete nonsense. But it's certain tasks like that, I think it could be really, really useful. So
I also say that whilst it still has quite a lag in its training, if you ask it questions about Kubernetes 1.26, do you think it's going to be able to help you? Maybe not, because it's got that cutoff. So as long as it's a bug that existed back when it was trained, it'll help you. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not that smart enough to understand if it can determine things that's newer, bugs that are newer than what it was trained on. I don't know how it handles.
So you have to give it all the context. That's what I've seen is that people are feeding it 126 manifests as examples and then asking it questions based on it. And it does seem to have a weird ability to understand what's happening and answer questions. Like it could be retrained with modern data if you're willing to give it the modern data. Do you think this is something you would hook into Portainer?
I am all about making things easier for our users. So if this was a way to make things easier, we actually had a discussion. We used to include compose with a K in Portainer. So you could take a Docker compose file and we would auto deploy that against Kubernetes. We had to pull it out because it was full of CVEs. If this was a way to bring back that type of capability where someone could give Portainer a compose file, we asked ChatGPT to convert it, and then it gave us back our manifest, so we could then go direct deploy. I'll take that.
That would be cool. Yeah,
that'll be cool. So absolutely, if we can use it to improve the service that we deliver to our users, I'm all over it.
Yeah, I also wonder, like from the Google and Scaleway point of view, can we have an understanding of all the resources we have and then give us cost optimizations, or even just remind you that you've had an instance running that you're not using anymore? Like, hey, the traffic on this virtual machine hasn't really moved a needle in 10 days. Do you want to shut it down? Are we going to see more stuff like this?
Most of our recommendation tips that we have in the Google Cloud Console are actually ML based. They're not Bard based. They're not based on ChatGPT. Like right now, if you log into the Google Cloud Console, there will be some recommendation in your virtual machine interface to say, hey, you haven't used this virtual machine for a while.
Oh, wow.
So that's actually ML based. And another place where we are using a machine learning based model is we have a software called Cloud Armor, which is like a web application firewall. It's a WAF. So you can attach it to a cloud load balancer, and then it can do a bunch of things like XSS, like a cross-site scripting, detection, SQL injection, etc. But one of the things it does is something called predictive traffic analysis. So basically, when you turn that on, it creates a base model for your traffic on your load balancer. And if it sees something weird, it can actually notify you and say, hey, we're seeing these IP addresses are potentially going to be harmful. And you can turn it on to either create a firewall rule to block those IP addresses automatically, or just give you a recommendation and tell you, please apply this policy to block those IP addresses. And last year, that feature was used by one of the customers, and it helped them block the largest DDoS attack known to human in history. It was like 47 million requests or something like that. So they didn't have the automatic feature; they just had the recommendation feature. But somebody caught that early and managed to apply the policy to prevent issues. So in these kind of cases, I do see value for using machine learning based, whether they are ChatGPT or Bard or something else, but something that is clever enough to see what your base usage is and can detect deviations, right? But this is not new to ChatGPT. This is like deviation detection in machine learning is a very old problem, right? So ChatGPT as is today, being useful for us with what we do today, I'm very skeptical, but that's just me.
Yeah, I sort of think of ChatGPT as it's almost like a toy or like a demo of like the technology, the ML technology in targeted ways, like exactly as you say, like very specific targeted ways that's trained for this one purpose, I think have an enormous potential. I'm thinking about like observability, like price prediction, all of these things, but it may not be like ChatGPT in particular. It may be something more specifically purpose built.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you all for joining. It's been a pleasure talking with you all. I'll give you all a minute if you just want to plug anything, share anything that may be. Feel free to do that now, and then we'll wrap this up. I
don't want to plug Portainer at all. That just seems that seems shallow. But so no, I think the more people that get exposed to containers and Kubernetes and realize that not everyone needs to be an expert, the better. I think there are varying levels of skill required And I think we need to be completely comfortable that those out there in the ecosystem have varying levels of skill, and embrace them, and have tools and capabilities that help. The ChatGPT conversation just then is a prime example. It helps those underskilled do things that their more skilled peers might be able to do. So anything that helps people increase the skill level is a good thing.
I'm going to do a shameless plug and ask people to go listen to the Kubernetes podcast. We had David on it. That was the last episode. It was pretty cool to talk to you. But we have a bunch of stuff coming up, very interesting things. We're going to be covering platform engineering and backstage is one of the topics. We're going to be covering Docker and WASM as well. And we're going to be also covering KubeCon Amsterdam. So we're going to be asking people, just harassing people in the show, asking them like how it's going on. So it's kubernetespodcast.com, where you can follow us on Twitter. And thank you for having me. It was fantastic.
I suppose my plug would be my team at Scaleway, the developer relations team. We do some live streams almost every Friday. Not this one coming, but almost every Friday at 3 p.m. UK time. We go live and chit chat about the cloud. Sometimes we have guests. We just did a bunch of Kubernetes focus streams during March. So if that's your jam, come and hang out with us. You can find us on Twitter at Scaleway_devs, and we always tweet when we're going live. It would be really good to have folks come and harass us on stream.
Cool.
All right. Awesome.